Welcome back to the ADM+S in Conversation podcast. I'm Natalie Campbell, and today I'm joined by Dr Dang Nguyen, ADM+S Research Fellow in the School of Media and Communications at RMIT University. Dang researches the social implications of technology by bringing together methods from a range of disciplines and by looking beyond Western contexts. Dang's current work examines the digitality of knowledge making and its implications on the information environment, the conditions of possibility of contemporary technological cultures, and automated informality and its moral economies. But today, Dang's joining me to chat about your brand new book, Internet Cures. Dang, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You are most welcome. What is Internet Cures about?
It does exactly what it says on the tin. This book is about the cures we find on and through the internet. So these can be anything from cure-alls and self-concocted remedies that we saw on the internet, for example, during COVID-19, such as, consuming boiled lemongrass and orange zest before entering or leaving the house in order to boost your immunity. Or even using a hairdryer to blow hot air along the spine and toes to improve your constitution and therefore limiting your chances of catching COVID.
I had heard some crazy examples of these, but reading the introduction to your book was like opening up a whole new world. I love it.
I know. They sound bizarre, but these were all cures and remedies that were being shared across Southeast Asia during the early days of COVID. And for me, these are miracular. As the subtitle suggests, to the extent that they hail from a long history of local medical traditions where things like gemstones, metals, and in particular plants are thought to have protective or therapeutic or even sometimes harmful effects on the body. And then there are also emergent and novel forms of enacting miraculous healing on and through the internet using technologies such as live streaming. So my favorite story from the field is this charismatic healer in Vietnam that I shadowed for a year, who swore that he could heal patients living as far away as Europe from Vietnam through his phone because the 4G network supposedly is robust enough to carry his healing energy through the air all the way across the oceans. And his patients in Europe reportedly felt the impact of his energy through their device and got better. Now, if we suspend our disbelief for a moment and think about what these instances tell us about the entanglement of things like magic and miracles with science and technology, then we start to realize that notions of magic and miracle are rather persistent features of how we have always imagined, thought about, and experienced our socio-technical worlds. So in my book, I looked at a particular empirical domain of this persistent paradigm, which is the context of Vietnamese diasporic and transnational healing communities.
It's so interesting to hear you tell that story because it sounds kind of crazy when you explain it like that. But when you think back, like the idea of the internet or the idea of, being able to jump online and talk to someone on the other side of the world, not so much today, but like, a couple of decades ago or whatever, that was miraculous enough in itself. So now to think that the possibility of like healing powers or something else being transmitted through these machines, I can see why it wouldn't be that far-fetched for some people.
Exactly.
So you cover a lot in this book. What inspired you? How did you get here?
Yeah, so like most books, mine came into being over a rather protracted period of time and it sort of spanned across many geographical locations. So I became interested in studying internet cures around 2017 when the research agenda around misinformation was taking shape after the first election of Donald Trump in the US. So there was a real uptick in research interest around the role of misinformation in political campaigns. And it's almost like all of a sudden scholars, journalists, and researchers alike became very invested in understanding the spread of misinformation, where misinformation comes from, and also its effects on public opinion. So it was sort of like we suddenly woke up to the fact that people say inaccurate and misleading things on the internet. So around that time, I was developing my PhD proposal. And so I thought, well, cool, let's study misinformation misinformation if that's what people are going to care about for the next 4 or 5 years. But I wasn't interested in
You chose
studying.
well. I think we're more years on and it's still just as relevant.
Yeah. True. But I think at the time I wasn't really interested in studying political misinformation as such, because I grew up in an information environment where, context has never been decoupled from information in quite the same way that I think much of the Western world has come to articulate the concept of information. So information as a commodity and as a resource that can be carried and transferred across media as if it's media independent and context free. The specter of who's doing the mass communication and providing information in post-war Southeast Asia has sort of never left those of us who are embedded in that context. So it just wasn't something I thought was interesting enough to study, or more truthfully, one that I wouldn't have anything interesting to contribute to, I thought. But I was interested in studying the internet cures that I mentioned earlier, which were running amok on social media. And they were genuinely interesting to me, mostly because at the time I couldn't decide what to make of them. I think it would have been easy to just call them health misinformation, piggybacking on the misinformation research agenda that was taking shape. But it struck me that that wasn't very insightful. Sure, drinking boiled garlic juice probably won't shield you against COVID. But why boiled garlic juice
Right.
in particular,
Yeah.
why on Facebook, and also why in the specific media formats that we encounter them. So being a media studies researcher, I was motivated by these sorts of questions, and I was kind of annoyed that nobody was really asking them. So I started my PhD the following year at the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. And it was a fantastic discipline to do this sort of project in, because it forced me to think, surprise, surprise, historically and philosophically about internet cures. So it really is through this classic humanities point of view that I started formulating my approach, which intentionally sidestepped the popular approach that I often call the misinformation warfare approach, where you see researchers sort of became ordained as critical agents in untangling the intricate web of deceptive tactics on the internet in order to uncover the truth and shedding light on the complexities of information manipulation. What I wanted to do was a bit different. So I wanted to enrich the misinformation research agenda by infusing the notion of misinformation with history and culture, and doing all of that while taking the technologies that co-constitute this misinformation phenomenon seriously. So over time, I realized that this task requires the development of new languages and also the eclectic use of methods that might not otherwise usually accompany one another. And so that was how the project took shape. And along the way, I invented some new terminologies to account for my historically and philosophically informed articulation of internet cures, and also mobilized computational methods alongside ethnographic methods to study them.
I'm really interested, just on a quick sidebar, you've going back, and we're not really going back that far because you're a media studies scholar. That's the space that you were in when you came to conceptualize your PhD. You mentioned that when COVID was happening, and that's when this really blew up and it was like people woke up to it. Do you remember before that, like what was the conversation around misinformation, and why do you think that the discourse around it became so much more prevalent?
Yeah, I do remember that the term misinformation itself is new. I don't think prior to 2016, with the event of the first election of Donald Trump, people really used the term misinformation.
Yeah.
I think before misinformation, people say fake news. And then
Right.
around that time, I remember a lot of media and communication scholars, as well as philosophy scholars, commenting on how fake news is just a really broad and problematic term that doesn't really tell us anything about the nature of
Definitely
information.
doesn't carry the severity, like that connotation is not there compared to mis or disinformation as well, which is interesting.
And I remember reading a lot of papers just trying to pin down how we should define misinformation and disinformation around that time. So it really is, from my point of view, a reaction against the political events happening in the US.
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution. But getting back on track and taking a closer look at your research, can you talk more about this idea of miracles and magic being integral to the way that we imagine and think about technology?
Sure, I'm so glad you asked that question. I think there is this flawed and outdated and yet persistent notion that human cultures progress through roughly 3 stages of development, right? So we go from the age of magic, where we lived in a constant state of baffled and awe by the natural world into which we were born, to the age of religion, in which we devised religious narratives to make sense of, but also measure into being our social and natural world, to our current age of science and technology, where we conduct ourselves or aspire to conduct ourselves in a rational way using scientific knowledge. And each of these phases is often understood to be discrete and separate from the one that comes after it. And that's just wrong. In fact, what we see is magic, religion, and science and technology have always been interlinked. So in many cultures, religion and magic are one and the same. And some cultures would see others' religions as magic, and vice versa. So in terms of how magic is thought to function, we have on the one hand sympathetic magic, right, which concerns the invisible relationship or bond between things, either through contact or similarity or ritual. So an example of this would be the voodoo doll, where you stick sharp objects in the image of an enemy and they will feel the pain, right? And then in the healing realm, we have things like drawing blood from a witch, which would then make the victim of the witch feel better as sort of an anti-witch spell.
Right.
You know, we have all of these things in our culture and we remember them.
Yeah.
Then on the other hand, we have natural magic, which contains aspects of sympathetic magic plus hidden properties of the natural world. So things like gemstones or metals and plants that are thought to have protective or therapeutic or harmful powers. Then we also have, as a third category probably, mechanical or technological magic. So if we think of writing as a kind of technology, then we can, for example, think of the common device of drawing X so that Y would happen as a sort of mechanical spell. So I just rewatched Beetlejuice recently because of Halloween. And this is, what happened when Adam and Barbara followed the instructions of the handbook of the recently deceased to draw a door on the brick wall using chalk and then knock on it 3 times in order to open up a portal to the afterlife bureaucracy, right? So that's kind of a mechanical spell. And mechanical spells are meant not to summon some form of spiritual intervention, but rather to unlock human potential to influence the external world.
I'm embarrassed to say I haven't seen Beetlejuice, but I'm sure that is a perfect analogy.
Yeah, you really should. It's a fantastic movie.
Okay, noted.
Yeah. Well, sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but okay. So going back to our book, and to recall an earlier example from the field that I mentioned, where the charismatic healer insisted on spreading healing energy through 4G networks, right, and smartphones. This was a very elaborate, even though misguided, articulation of digital technologies where the internet was understood as a medium, literally, that allows the employment of quasi-physical magical powers to intervene on the conditions of patients who lived overseas. Now, one way we can try to explain or understand this is by linking this domain of magic making with the logic of play in the digital context. So let's take an example of children when they play. When you watch children play, you will notice that they would usually provide a continuous stream of commentary on their own behavior. So, for example, now I'm doing this, now I'm doing that, now this will happen.
It's like willing it into reality.
Yeah, yeah. And anthropologists who study play usually liken this sort of play to the format of spells, where reality is constantly idealized during the process of play. So when a child likens themselves to a plane, for example, with arms extended and making the appropriate sound effects and swooping movements, what they're doing is actually they're enacting an unrealizable reality. But this unrealizable reality is actually never confused with actual reality. So at no point during play does the child, in fact, think that they're an actual airplane. What the airplane does is it sets the ultimate goal towards which play can be oriented, and it gives the act of play intelligibility and meaning.
Right.
So when the healer in question forces his internal energy out through his palms over the phone screen, while narrating the impact of his actions. So now I'm healing this part. Now you can stop feeling your back pain, and so on. It really is quite similar to a child transforming themselves into an airplane, right? It's the kind of play that requires participation, and perhaps complicity on the part of the patient in order to materialize.
The interesting thing about that also is just like, that is a great example. But when you think of a kid doing that when they're playing, they're usually saying those things out because they're convincing themselves. Mm-hmm. They're very much like looking inwards with this, bringing this idea to reality. Whereas in this example of this practitioner, it's like, it's not just him convincing himself. You're convincing the person on the other end of the line.
That's
and
right.
I guess that's also where this, like the miracle of internet and technology comes in.
Exactly, yeah. And I reckon there's a fair amount of self-persuasion happening there as well.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So in the sense that the patient actually confirms that they feels cured.
Yeah.
It's part of that play, It requires that loop of feedback. So yeah, in that instance, we see that the internet is sort of understood as possessing special qualities that can facilitate the therapeutic experience. If you happen to not live in close proximity to each other, then here's this technological infrastructure that allows you to enact these miracles.
And it's not actually the technology, it's the concept.
Yeah, exactly. It's the concept of the technology. That's right. And we see that these qualities might not be intrinsic to the technology itself. So not everyone can perform these miraculous acts, right? If I claim to be possessing that miracle power in me and trying to cure diseases for someone random on the internet, that probably won't work. It has to be the charismatic healer, and it has to
context is important.
Yeah. The patients who have actually entrusted him with these powers. So and this sort of miracle can be activated through the performance of certain rituals, in particular events. So I guess what I want to say with this is that, we see that the internet is more than just a technical system that transmits data around the world. It actually has a distinct palliative function in our society across different domains. And I think health and illness is just one such domain.
Absolutely. And so to study this, you've already mentioned that this is, you've brought together a range of different methods that haven't perhaps previously been used together for this kind of research. Can you tell me a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, sure. So my book is among the first of its kind to feature a mix of computational methods and ethnographic research in the same treatment of the topic. But there is a growing number of social researchers who are doing this, so marrying different traditions and strands of digital research methods together so that they so that we can say new things and make novel claims about the things that we study. So in that sense, my book is sort of a love letter to the project of the digital humanities, which is often characterized by an enthusiastic embrace of, but also critical inquiries into computing and digital technologies in all that they can offer to the study of humanities and social sciences subjects. With the computational component of the book, I was concerned chiefly with the nature of the digital written word and what we can do with it. So in chapter 2, for example, I did a large-scale cohort analysis of literature around traditional medicine to propose a different way of naming these practices. And so I propose calling them non-biomedical modalities instead. This chapter is quite technical, so I won't get into details here. But in other computational chapters, I was interested in passing the migration of our dominant written culture onto social media and how this migration is enabling the digital codification of existing bodies of miraculous cures and allowing them to take on network-like expressions. So there is a chapter in the book where I did a network analysis of different miracle online communities, as it were, in order to understand whether there is a lot of cross-pollination across different healing traditions. Now, intuitively, I think we would guess that there might be a lot of cross-pollination since we often hear about how the internet is democratizing information flows, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
The adage of, information wants to be free and so on. But my analysis found that that's not the case with Vietnamese communities of healing, and that the propagation of traditional knowledge on social media tend to follow really distinct historical boundaries. So in the same chapter, I also conducted topic modeling of the data that I collected so that I could use the results to then guide the qualitative component of the work. And just to talk a little bit more about the content of the book, chapter 4 is actually where I really meditated on how each era of writing technology created the capacity for different kinds of socialities and conceptualizations of knowledge. And that in turn preconfigures how the use of internet media is just one more technological shift in that longer history. It is also the chapter where I historicize the object of study, which is, internet discussions of miracle cures, and also the very method of inquiry, so computational analysis of internet discussions, in order to show how both the object of study and the method are entangled with each other and become like affordances of each other. So this is an approach pretty typical of the digital humanities. So I love all of my chapters equally, of course, but in terms of showcasing my love for the digital humanities, chapter 4 is where this love really makes itself at home.
Take note, everyone.
Chapter 4, go read chapter 4. And in terms of ethnographic work, I was lucky enough to spend a year in the US through a Fox Fellowship at Yale University. So I took the opportunity to reach out to a number of diasporic healing communities who forge and maintain very close ties to those in mainland Vietnam. And I was able to formulate that sort of transnational component of the work, which would not have been possible otherwise. So, there's a lot of luck involved in any research project. Including things like opportunities to conduct fieldwork in more than one research site. During my time at Yale, I also interacted a lot with the anthropology and the sociology departments, and this experience really shaped many of the strands of the work that I did for the book, and also much of the work that I'm doing even today.
I'm interested, so you mentioned before that, you've obviously this big mix of methods, but you talk about like your network analysis and the actual people who are part of these communities, like the people individually, their existing belief systems, why they're participants in this community. Did you have any interesting observations from that angle?
Yeah, sure. I think what really opened up my analysis in doing this sort of approach is you really get to paint a I suppose more complete picture of these phenomena. So what I tend to think about when I do this sort of work is I think of myself as sort of like painting a landscape of the thing I try to study. So in the background, you have really macro level things like, you know, the history and the culture against which people enact their digital lives. Then in the middle ground, you have things like economic influences, economic forces that inevitably shape their behavior. And in the foreground, you have the everyday stuff, you know. So if someone is sick and they happen to be alone and feeling lonely in this experience of feeling sick, what do? You know, they log into Facebook on their phone and they watch these live streams and they interact with people who provide with a sense of community that would otherwise not be available to them at all. So being a mixed method researcher really kind of it allows me this sort of big picture view. Where
I was going to say it paints a full picture, and I didn't even mean that to be a pun, but yeah, you're right.
You as a researcher, you kind of want that full picture. So and on each level of analysis, you inevitably have to assume the role of a researcher from another discipline almost, right? So when you think about the background stuff, you know, inevitably you have to consult literature in history, you know. While drinking boiled garlic juice. If that just comes
Did you get an answer to that, by the way?
I think it has something with the belief that garlic boosts your immunity.
Yeah.
There's a lot of boosting your immunity, you know, in these sorts of things. And also it has healing power and protective power. But yeah, so if you're just confronted with these things on social media, they're kind of baffling. You don't understand why people say these things. So you do have to need some form of knowledge about history and the kind of belief that people have that are long-standing. In addition to the everyday stuff that you see in the foreground.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great explanation.
Thank you.
So we've been talking about the interdisciplinary nature of your work, but I wanted to ask you, what does that actually look like to you in terms of methodologies? And I guess, how does that relate to some of the work that you're doing at ADM+S?
Yeah, sure. So again, I think I've been describing myself as a mixed methods researcher. And what that entails on a practical level, on a day-to-day basis, is constantly putting myself into conversation with colleagues from different disciplines to learn about the different conversations and perspectives happening in their communities and sort of just letting them influence my own approach. My own training in the digital humanities and social sciences sort of sensitized me to this early on. And ADM+S is sort of the first professional context that I've been in where this is not only an advantage, but also something that's actively encouraged. So at the moment, I'm leading an ADM+S project that examines informal economic activities in automated media systems. And I'm doing so alongside my colleagues in computer science and anthropology across the center. And the subject matter really requires this sort of interdisciplinary approach. So on the one hand, you know, it is really important to understand the social context and lived experience of people who engage in these persisting informal economic practices across geographical contexts, you know, so the foreground stuff. But also on the other hand, we need the sort of systems level investigation that requires technical expertise to disentangle how automated technical infrastructures enable economic informality in often unexpected and surprising ways, you know, so the middle ground stuff.
Exactly. Well, so this new book is about internet cures, and now you're working on automated informality, as you just explained. Do you see these projects fitting together at all? And if they do, what is next for you?
There is a through line in the various projects that I've been working on, I think, even though you're right, as first look, they may seem unrelated. So broadly speaking, as a researcher, I am interested in the social implications of media and technology. And I mobilize methods from different disciplines to study these implications. And over time, I find myself working in different empirical domains. So you could say that my new book's subject matter is in the health domain, maybe. But I think of it as much as being about media and technology as it is about health.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at the moment, what I'm working on is probably in the economics domain. But then again, it is just as much about media and technology as it is about economic practices. Another through line in my work is it is often grounded in empirical work in Southeast Asia and particularly Vietnam. And Vietnam and Southeast Asia is sort of an extremely understudied context across all the empirical domains that we've mentioned, and also in media and technology studies. So I feel fortunate that I happen to be Vietnamese, and so I'm intimately familiar with this context.
It's so interesting to say that they're understudied because they're so rich in the material that you're talking about,
You're
especially
right.
like the health remedies and the histories of that.
Absolutely. So I can see very clearly the opportunities to enrich the disciplines that I'm trying to contribute to with my knowledge of this context. I'm currently studying fawn farming in Southeast Asia, for example. And my work so far has allowed me to be in conversation with colleagues from a wide range of disciplines who are fascinated by this practice, but perhaps unsure about how to approach it beyond the usual journalistic framing of fawn farming as, shadowy and harmful. So infusing the study of economic informality with a socio-technical perspective will be my focus for the next few years. And hopefully the next time we sit down and speak to each other again, it will be about my next book on this topic.
Hopefully, that sounds good. I won't hold you to the timeline, but I'm sure you'll have the work there to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me, Dang. I think we've hit all of our talking points. Is there anything additional that you wanted to add?
That's it from me, really.
It from you? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, Dang. Internet Cures, published by Bristol University Press, can be purchased online via the link in this episode's show notes.